Maybe you like cooking. Maybe you don't. Either way, the new Blue Apron is for you. Because along with our classic meal kits, we're offering new pre-made and one-pan meals to help you get dinner on the table fast. And now there's no subscription needed, so you can just order and enjoy. Do delicious food your way. Shop 100 plus meals at blueapron.com. Get 50% off your first 2 orders with code APRON50. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.
All right, I'm here this week with Ryan Baldi, who's written a new book called The Dream Factory, which is about youth football and a really deep dive into the world of youth football. So, Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Pleased to be here.
Great. So I guess you open the book with a sort of anecdote from Tony Whelan, the longtime United coach, who talks about his sort of passion, deep passion for the game. And especially youth football and sort of this pastoral sense he has of need to look after the younger players. And I guess that's my first question, really, the inspiration behind why you took on this project and why you wanted to look at a kind of curious part of the football world.
That's exactly it. You kind of put your finger on it there. It was like a general curiosity I think a lot of fans will share. I think a lot of people know which clubs have a good academy and which don't have a particularly productive academy based on the number of players coming through to the first team. But I don't think generally many fans know what goes into that on a kind of deeper level. I was the same. I just wanted to kind of know more about that. And yeah, that was the idea, to go and explore it, to try and get into these places if I could. To be honest, I didn't think it would be possible. I thought it's quite a closed off world, or at least It seems to be from the outside. Clubs keep their cards pretty close to their chest with what goes on behind academy doors, I think because more often than not the stories that come out are negative. So I think they probably just try to bat it away, and anything that does come out is from sort of club controlled media. So I didn't think they'd let an outsider in to go and have a nose around. But fortunately I found that the people doing the day-to-day work, the coaches, the academy managers, and were really keen to kind of show their work and show the positive aspects of what they do, and they were also really aware and cognizant of the negatives too, and weren't shying away from those. So I was able to go in and get a really kind of balanced view of academy life. So I spent a couple of years going up and down the country. I think I visited about 12 academies, from right at the top of the top, the Uniteds, the Cities, the Liverpools, down to like Shrewsbury Town. I went to Fulham, Kidderminster, and like the 7th tier. So you get a complete full perspective of everything that goes on, and hear stories from parents and players and coaches and administrators and people who are setting policies and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted to give as wide and broad a perspective as possible, but also bring that kind of personal detail to it, which is what I was trying to do.
Yeah, and policy plays a really distinct part in the book, doesn't it? From the academy at Lilleshall, if people remember that many years ago, the FA Centre, to the elite player performance plan and the controversies around that. I'm not sure it's the central theme of your book, but it sort of plays a very distinct role in how clubs think about player production, the factory element of it, and player transfer value and the impact it has on the players themselves. I mean, was that a kind of surprise about how much policy is affecting and shaping how the world of youth football works?
Perhaps not. I know there's a lot of red tape, and there are mixed feelings even within the game about EPPP, the Elite Player Performance Plan, which is a current set of rules that governs youth football in the top 4 tiers. It's been in place for about a decade now, and I think there's some disenchantment with it, but it's definitely driven change and raised standards, but I think there's still a long way to go. So what I was intrigued to find out was how those people kind of living by those rules on a day-to-day basis, the players and the coaches, felt about them, what they thought needed to be tweaked, what they thought needed to be kept. And then speaking to the people who are in charge of that and setting these policies, as we said, I kind of came to the conclusion that they feel as though they're a lot closer to cracking the big issues of aftercare and welfare than the lived experiences of the players and the parents that I spoke to. So it was interesting to me to find that the policy that they believe is, if not completely adequate, then pretty close to it, is probably further short of it than they quite realise.
Yeah, and I guess there's two particularly controversial aspects. One is the care of the players and players being dumped as early as, I think you have an anecdote from a player who's maybe 7 and got a form rejection email. And so, yeah, let's talk about that for a little bit, the impact on players of it being this kind of almost a production line. I mean, I think it's 12,000, you mentioned, kids going through academies at any one time of all standards, and a 0.5% will ever make it to the first team or something like that.
Yeah, there's just so much attrition that I don't think it's a good thing. I spoke to the journalist David Kahn about it, who's done a lot of work around aftercare and the lack thereof within the elite academies, and he put it in a really interesting way. He said that if we accept and we know and we acknowledge that even a conservative, favourable on the football club side estimate of the process would say that 90% of these players don't get through. That's being very generous to these clubs, because it's probably a lot higher than that who don't end up having a career in the game. If we accept that 90% don't get through, then that's 90% of the kids who are being dragged into the system who are leaving before the end of the process. So we can't think of these academies as dream factories, to borrow the title of the book. We've got to think of them as broken dream factories. That is their primary product, is heartbreak, essentially. So there needs to be a flipping of the focus to that those players who don't get through should be the primary focus, because those are the major product that they produce. So that was an interesting way of looking at it. And what I was very fascinated to find out was that most of the coaches I spoke to, pretty much to a man or a woman, would agree that academies are taking clubs too young and they're taking too many of them. Tony Whelan expressed a similar sentiment. I cited the example of Bayern Munich doing away with, I think the 9s and the 10s or something. Yeah, I think they're not recruiting players below the under 12 level anymore. And most of the coaches I spoke to would love to see a similar thing adopted. And a lot of work that goes on now in academies of the ones who are really working towards making it an enriching experience for these kids is all about protecting childhood, as Tony Whelan said, kind of ring fencing this, the kind of naivety of childhood and the fun of it all, and not making it too serious too soon. A lot of clubs now, Burnley were one. They've made wholesale changes to their academy since I was there, which is a whole separate topic. But John Pepper, who was the academy manager when I went there, talked to me about how they do kind of multi-sport programs, and they'll have nights where on one of their allocated nights to be with their youngsters, they'll just take them to the cinema or take them to Laser Quest or something, and just have that kind of bonding time with them. So yeah, I think there's an acknowledgement from the people who are doing the day-to-day work that the system isn't right. They're working within it and trying to, I think, do the best they can. But the system itself, the lawmakers and the clubs, I call it the arms race for talent, because they're all after the best young talent, as young as possible in as great a quantity as possible, for fear of their rivals snapping up and then missing out. They don't want to miss out on the next Rashford or Foden for fear of the other club getting them. So they're chasing these 4 and 5-year-olds and trying to bring them all in as early as possible. So it kind of perpetuates.
And some of the skullduggery that goes on is, I guess, a result of that competition between clubs for ever younger players to hoover them up. And there's anecdotes of, although I think it happens less these days, and there's more professionalism in youth recruitment, but of people hiding behind trees and passing out business cards in car parks and trying to get in touch with parents and offering inducements in bars and holidays and all sorts of stuff. So, I mean, do you get a sense of that competition still driving those kind of behaviours? Are we getting to a point where the balance between trying to recruit everyone versus thinking about the actual humans involved is there yet?
Well, I'm sure that there are best practices in place now, and clubs are more aware of these kind of practices that go on. But as long as that arms race for talent perpetuates, as long as they're still wanting as many kids as they do and bringing as many in as they do, those sorts of things are going to happen, because scouts are fighting to justify their own existence and trying to move up the ladder themselves. Parents are sold the dream themselves by the thousands, and clubs are bringing in these players in waves, and in an effort, like I said, to kind of one up or just keep up with the Joneses, essentially, always looking over the fence at seeing what Man United might be looking at what Man City doing and vice versa, and always wanting to stay one step ahead. So that's what leads to what goes on in these kind of nefarious practices. Some of it is contravenes the rules, some of it is just kind of wily tricks of the trade. Like I use the example of Mason Mount. I interviewed his dad for the book at length. He was scouted when he was 6 scouted by Chelsea.
Right.
So he lived in Portsmouth, was a Portsmouth fan. He was scouted by Chelsea in his very first game on grass as a 6-year-old. He'd never played a game of football on grass before. And at 6, they spotted him. The scout approached his dad after the tournament that he'd seen him in and said, "I'm a scout from Chelsea. I'd love to bring Mason in this Friday." And his dad said, "No, we're not interested. He just started playing football. We just wanted to enjoy it. We're really not interested." Scout said, "Okay, fair enough." And then a week or two later, Tony Mount gets a call from the club's the youth team's manager. The local grassroots team was called Bull Hunt. The manager called him up and he said, "Oh, you'll never guess what. We've been invited to a football festival at Chelsea's Cobham Academy in a couple of weeks' time. All the boys are going to get to go and see their academy and see the facilities." And he knew right away what had gone on.
What a coincidence!
They weren't really, exactly. They weren't really taking no for an answer. So once Mason went to that, saw what was on offer, the facilities and the stars around the place and whatnot, he was sold and wanted to go back, and that was that. And they've been very happy there. He was quick to point out over there, however many years it's been, however old he is now, it must be a good 15 years or more. But he did kind of, as someone who was a non-league manager for many years himself, he's been in the game a long time. Tony Mount kind of knew what was going on and saw it coming and was kind of able to manage it as much as he can. But you can imagine how parents of kids who don't have that background in the game, who aren't so kind of aware of what goes on, might be swept up in it a little bit more.
Well, that's right, and the financial inducements are significant, even if it's not Premier League wages levels yet. When they're 6 years old, there are financial inducements involved, and especially for some of the kids from a sort of more traditional football background, not necessarily wealthy parents or wealthy communities. There's a lot of incentives there. I mean, I guess that ties into Mount. Mount appears in your book again later when you talk about sort of the pathway forward, because that's the goal, isn't it, of youth football, to get players into a professional career. And at one stage he's considering whether he's going to make it in the game and whether there really is a pathway into the first team. And for what percentage of players who go through academies? Well over 90%. There's no chance of that.
Exactly. Yeah. That was a really interesting story to share, because of course he did make it through, but he needed a lot to line up for him to do that. So he was kind of one of the jewels of their academy for many years. He was widely regarded as one of the best prospects for his age in the country. Played at all the England youth levels, had approaches from other rival clubs, other kind of quote-unquote Big Six clubs, but wanted to stay with Chelsea and backed himself, and ultimately was proven right. But would he have gotten there without Chelsea's transfer ban, without Frank Lampard coming in? And when he did, after he just had that year with him on loan at Derby, the stars really kind of aligned for him. So it just goes to show that even if you have all the requisite talent and dedication and work ethic and everything else that is required of you, you still need an awful lot of luck. So for the kids who aren't of the Mason Mount level, or who might be just as good or even better, but don't quite have the stars aligned for them in the same way, then they face a more uncertain future. So that's kind of a damning indictment on the system itself, that someone as good and as talented and as highly regarded a prospect as Mason Mount still needed a lot to go for him that was completely out of his control, and for him to kind of break through at Chelsea.
Yeah. And some of it is in the players' control, I guess, but it really depends on the coaches. So you talk about, I mean, there's a part of your book that talks about what happened with Steve Walters and some other players who go from bad coaching to sometimes even worse than that, and the impact it has on their confidence, mentality, ability to make it in the game. We forget sometimes these are kids, and I don't know about you. I've got 3, so and I don't know. I would be much of a good sports coach. I know I'm not, actually, because I moved to the States 18 months ago and I now coach Little League. I know nothing about baseball except it's a stick and a ball. So coaching kids is really hard, and it's especially, as we know, and sometimes football clubs get it wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a parent too. I have 2 young boys. One is actually his birthday today. He's 4. I've been spent most of the afternoon trying to put together a climbing frame in the garden for him in the rain. But it's something I've thought about too, going through this process of learning all these things and meeting all these people and hearing all these stories and thinking I have my own little boy who might show an interest in football sometime soon. I've thought about putting myself in that position of what would I do, what would I want him to do, and again, to go back to Tony Mount, you could say it's easy for him because his son went through it came out unscathed and is now a millionaire superstar playing for England and Chelsea and whatever else. But he just said, you just got to make sure they're enjoying it. If they're not enjoying it, pull them out. You can't yourself have any delusions about what's going to be at the end of the rainbow for them.
Right.
Kind of never really look beyond the next season, and always just kind of check in with them and make sure that what they're doing it is enriching them in some way, regardless of what the outcome is going to be ultimately, and just be honest with them at every point. But yeah, then that responsibility, you feel that deeply as a parent. You never know for sure, I guess, whether that's kind of mirrored at the club. I think on a kind of institutional level, it's not, because of the sheer numbers. As we saw with as you mentioned, there was a 7-year-old boy whose story I told in the book.
Yep.
He broke his leg playing for a Premier League academy. He was 7, so he was too young to be formally registered, but he was in pre-academies of 4 Premier League Category 1 London academies. He broke his leg playing for one of them and worked his way back. Within a couple of weeks of returning to training, he was dumped. Essentially, his parents were sent an email that I called this chapter "Dear Parent Guardian" because I was able to replicate the email word for word as his father read it back to me, dictated it to me, and he said that they didn't even infill the name of the parents or the boy, as it was kind of a boilerplate email where you're supposed to click to infill the name, and it just left it as brackets, parent/guardian, close brackets at the top of the email. It was that impersonal. Nothing in the email itself related to anything that the boy had experienced. So he'd been with this club since he was 4. He was 7, so that's almost half of his little life, and
Right.
He'd worked his way back from a broken leg, got back to doing what he loved, and then was pretty quickly on the scrap heap. So I think at an institutional level, because of the numbers, there isn't that level of care that you feel as a parent, and that I know a lot of the coaches do feel too. On an individual level, a lot of the coaches are deeply aware of that responsibility, but until that's mirrored higher up, I don't think it's gonna be adequate, essentially.
And the heartbreak sort of goes throughout the journey from under 7s like that kid all the way through to the late teens, where they're looking at a first professional contract, and where they don't make it, they're sort of churned out of the system. And for the players at the elite academies, it seems to be particularly shocking, because they're then looking at lower league football or even non-league football as a pathway back into the professional game, and it looks completely different. And so you tell a few stories in the book about the impact on them, and sometimes it's just about the player themselves. They just didn't have it, or it's about their confidence and mentality. I mean, you talk about Callum Gribbin a little bit there, a player who many listeners will have seen for United youth teams, who still many people can't believe didn't make it because of the talent he held. But there, so many factors. But then they're dumped and they're sort of lost somewhere in the system. And having to make a really hard choice about whether to try and make it up from level 7 back into the pro game or not. And there's some interesting stories in the book about that.
Yeah, that comes back to what I mentioned earlier about there being a real gap between what the game believes to offer in terms of aftercare and provisions for welfare, what the lived experience of the people I spoke to suggests. So what I found to be particularly damaging is when a player is released, and so they face that initial rejection, but then that rejection is compounded by the trial process that they engage in from then on. So if a player wants to stay in the game, if they're released at 16, 17, they want to stay on the game, they can go to these exit trials that the EFL and the Premier League run for their academies, whereby it's been likened to a cattle market for young footballers, where there might be 150 players on one day. They'll be at a small non-league ground, or sometimes at Loughborough University there'll be 100 or so of scouts to be in attendance. There'll be your chance to kind of get back in somewhere and generate some interest. But you might have 20 minutes of the game to perform. You might be playing out of position with players you've never met, let alone played with before, so you have no kind of chemistry with, and you're out there trying to kind of fight for your footballing life, essentially, and you're just hoping that somebody's going to tick the box to say that they're interested in you. Scouts are there, they're not supposed to approach you directly, but it has happened where they kind of press their card into the palm of a parent. But it's kind of like footballing speed dating in a way, that they just kind of tick their box and you find out later whether they're interested in you. So that might lead somewhere, it might lead to another trial down the line. One of the young lads I spoke to was released by Fulham, a guy called Sam Armsworth. And he found that within a couple of weeks of being told he wasn't good enough for Fulham, who were a Premier League academy at the time, he then went on a trial at Brentford and was told he wasn't quite good enough for them. Then he was on a trial at Colchester and again was rejected after initial positive signs. And before he knew it, after 4 or 5 trials in a couple of weeks span, he was playing in the 7th tier just to kind of, or maybe in the 9th tier actually, just on a part-time basis, just to kind of keep his toe in. So you're kind of left reeling by that compounding rejection on one after another, from being told you're not good enough to be a Premier League footballer to being told you're not good enough to be a league footballer, and that's a lot to deal with for a young person who's kind of staked their future in the game, to be questioning all of that. And he certainly felt kind of cut off, didn't have any major support from the club, certainly, or from any of the outside organisations who profess to help. So
Right.
yeah, that's kind of the way it works, and it's that when rejection piles on top of more rejection, it can really beat a young person down, I think.
Yeah, I guess the clubs see it as a trade-off, don't they? So for time and investment in aftercare resources, in order to, that's not their motivation. Their motivation is to get players through to the first team or get them ready for sale, as you point out in some cases, or a bit of both. And looking after the players afterwards is time and resources that they don't necessarily feel that they've got. It kind of makes me think of the other side of the EPP that's pretty controversial, and that's the kind of financing side of it, because there's a lot of provisions in the plan that cost to be a Category 1 academy, and as a result some clubs have dumped that status, Brentford being a particular case in point, and who've just gone for a B team, essentially, the old reserve team style of doing things. But it's still, even 10 years after its introduction, pretty controversial, isn't it? Because it also has provisions about how much a player is worth from age 9 and up.
Yeah. Yeah, the fixed compensation is a big controversial point within the game. The smaller clubs feel it benefits the bigger clubs and allows them to stockpile. So as a kind of brief explainer for those who are unaware, any young player who signs with an academy at the under-9s level, which is the earliest point at which they can do it, then has an automatic value attached to them, and it's dependent on how long they spend in an academy and what level that academy is. All academies are graded 1 to 4 under EPP, with 1 being the highest. That's United's, the Liverpool's, the Chelsea's, and all the ones you've heard of. I think there are about 30 Category 1s now. So the longer you've been in a Category 1, the more you're worth, and I think it just adds up over time, and that it's to save wrangling and it's to stop. But the idea is that it stops players being caught in limbo as clubs argue over a fee, whether or not they're allowed to release a player. So now there's a fixed fee. If a buying club pays it, they get that player. But yeah, as I said, the smaller clubs feel it benefits the bigger clubs. They're allowed, who can come and hoover up their talent at an early age, and they're left with very little compensation. That's what motivated Brentford to do away with their academy and go for a B team system. So they let go, I think, around 120 players and shut down their academy operation because they lost Josh Bowie to Man United and Giancarlo Poveda to Man City, and I think they said they got about 60 grand compensation combined for the two. And they were like, well, what's the point if we're nurturing this talent only for them to be swept away at 14, 15, 16 before we get a chance to bring them through? Then there's no point in us investing in a Category 1 or Category 2 academy, which you can understand. So yeah, the fixed compensation element of EPP is a big bone of contention, and as you said, it's very expensive to run one of these academies, which leads to them becoming kind of very much run as businesses that have to kind of justify their own existence, and that's where rearing players for sale comes in. So one of the clubs I went to was Bury before they went under, literally a few weeks before they went under, actually. And I opened the book with that, by kind of juxtaposing their academy and what was going on there with what goes on at Man City, because interestingly, Bury were based at Man City's old training ground in Carrington, just down the road from United, and you can still see, and as you pull into the car park, you can see all the old signage from when City had been there. You can see the words Abu Dhabi and the City crest where it had been pulled off the facade of the building, but it hadn't been painted over, and the words Bury Football Club were falling down. There was no C and no B in club, and nobody had ever bothered to replace it. There was just no money for anything. And the academy manager there, Mark Litherland, who's now at Bolton, he explained to me how their best prospects they were essentially rearing for sale rather than for the first team. They opened about how they refer to Championship and Premier League clubs as their customers. So they had a specialty in producing ball-playing centre-halves who then go on to fetch them a couple of £100,000 maybe for a Premier League club. There were several examples that I noted in the book. So that's kind of what a lot of academies have to do to kind of justify their existence, is raise these players for sale. And even the likes of Man, one of the most prolific at it. They raise their academy is a profit machine. They raise hundreds of millions through the sales of players who make very little or no at all impact at first team level, as we've seen over the years. So yeah, it's very much a business, which is, I think, a result of the costs involved in running a club academy.
Yes, it's not in your book, but there was an interesting question put when the Glazers first came in at United 2005, in that they said, could you make money out of the transfer market? And sort of David Gill laughed it off and said, no, of course not. We're a buying club, United. But actually, some of the elite clubs really do have a profit centre. The Chelsea being one, who, I mean, I don't suppose anyone at Chelsea would ever say it, but it almost looks like that's run as a fourth income stream. Match day, TV, commercial, transfers. And it's all a bit unseemly, isn't it? Thinking about these kids from age 6 and up as being a potential profit centre.
Yeah, and Chelsea are one of the clubs, as I mentioned at the beginning, who are very closed off. I wasn't able to penetrate them too much, apart from speaking to people who've had experience from there who'd moved on. And so scouts worked for them previously, and obviously Tony Mount, who could tell me what Mason had been through from that perspective, and some ex-coaches. But yeah, they're one who are very guarded in what they put out there. So I do wonder if that's a reaction to some of the stockpiling accusations that get thrown at them. And like you said, the raising players for sale who've never... someone like Lewis Baker is quite a tragic example. He's one of the best young players in the country. I think he was a world champion with the under-20s at one point, but I think he left the club just a few months ago at 26, 27, something like that, having played maybe one appearance or something like that. So there's a really gifted young midfielder who was the type of player that had real prospects for England with his style at the time, just never really got a chance and then completely stagnated. And there are a few examples who are similar. They get caught in that system of loans that Chelsea operate, and they stagnate, they tread water. Someone like Mason Mount was able to kind of pull himself out of that, but there are dozens of examples of those who haven't, who are still stuck in that, or who have lost 6-7 years of their career to it.
Right, yeah. And, I mean, I guess contrasting with that, well, Manchester United just won the FA Youth Cup, so maybe they've come out the other side of the trough, but you have some interesting anecdotes about both United's sort of failures to produce players, so that notion is rejected by the coaches that you interviewed, but also failure to compete for transfers at one stage, and the sort of bureaucracy around the club stopping United moving quickly to capture players, which maybe they worked out, I suppose, given the rush to sign players before Brexit came in.
Yeah, that was quite evident, wasn't it? It was quite obvious that they were aware the tap was about to be turned off, so they got in as many as they could.
And they say no as well. They say that's not why we suddenly signed 8 or 9 players from around Europe, but yeah.
Yeah, I spoke to Derek Langley, who used to run the youth recruitment for United, who left on very kind of bitter terms with United and had some quite scathing things to say about Ed Woodward and his operation. And I think there was a time there where United were desperately lagging behind other academies. It's certainly in terms of recruitment, they had Langley told me about how they had reports on all the young Ajax players of that Champions League semi-final run long before they were stars, and they could have moved for them, but could never get the okay from the higher ups. They had a deal in place for Diogo Upamecano, who's now at Bayern Munich, the centre back. When he was 16, they had everything agreed, but an administration oversight over them failing to get the agreement put down on paper, he said, was what scuppered that deal. He and the player and his representatives went away and came back asking for more money after they'd already agreed to the terms of the deal. Langley said, well, to the club secretary at the time, he said, have you not got anything inked on this? Did we not pen that agreement? They said no, we left it as verbal. It was non-binding, so they came back asking for more money, and then before they could kind of react to that and go back to the table, he agreed to deal with, I think, RB Leipzig or one of the Red Bull teams at the time. So yeah, there was just a lot of examples of players who were missed at United at the time, but it is something that I believe has been addressed and worked on. I think the current regime are a lot better at that sort of thing than was the case maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, of course, towards the end of the book, you talk about the pathway and the ability to make it as a player, but also as a club. I guess we'll see whether United now have a current crop of players who will make. I can say honestly. I mean, I've seen plenty of them, and they're all talented, of course, because you have to be to be playing for United's under-18s or 23s. But still, the chances of like 1 or 2 making it into the first team, as to the level that, say, Marcus Rashford has, who you talk about a fair bit in your book, are still small, and that's youth football. It's hard. It's a very steep pyramid, and most of them fall off it.
Yeah, it is, and like I said, you need that element of luck, I think, to get over the line. I think the biggest leap is the one between being an elite youth prospect and being a first team regular. There's a long way to go between that, and it requires a lot of luck. Which, like I said, Rashford was one of the people I used as kind of a case study in the book, and I spoke to the coaches who worked with him, who brought him up, and talked about all the kind of care and attention that went into making him the player he was at 18, and then he got the opportunity because of injuries to Martial in the warm up, and to Michael Keane, who probably would have been ahead of him. Will Keane would have been ahead of him in the pecking order. Before that Michelin game, had he not injured himself just a few days before, so he still required that luck, and the fact that he came in and was able to start a game in his, what was at the time, his preferred position. They'd spent the last 2 years working on his skills as a striker, his movement, his finishing, and then he gets the opportunity to play there and to start there against fairly middling opposition at home at Old Trafford, rather than the way most young players are introduced to the first team is usually stuck out wide. If they're astray, even if they're a central striker, a goal scorer primarily, they'll be put on the wing, or a central midfielder will be put on the wing because they can't be trusted in the middle. So they'll be playing out of position. They'll be getting garbage time minutes at the end of the game, and that's what they've got to work with and to try and impress. So he was quite fortunate in many ways. He was able to kind of grasp the opportunity that was given to him. So yeah, with the talent that's there now, they're going to need something like that probably to really make their stamp.
Yes, they say hope is not a strategy, but in a way, like hoping that there's a batch of those kids that can actually make the leap is something that United probably need to progress. You actually, in that chapter about when you're talking about Rashford and the changing positions, so there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One, the insight on how coaches think about a player's position, and sometimes it's luck, but sometimes it's something they see. So you talk a lot about Trent Alexander-Arnold. I want to big up a Liverpool player, but generally regarded as a bit decent, and how coaches sort of spotted something in him that could work at right back. And then also there's a lot of detail about how coaches think about the kind of technical side of the game and the ability to use space and timing and movement, as well as lots and lots of video analysis and analysis of how players have done, and in order to get that through to the players, and the sort of hyper-technical training that at least the elite academies take part in. So it's kind of really interesting insight, I thought, into how youth coaching works and how it is that this factory churns out these high-quality players.
Yeah, so it might be kind of sacrilegious in many ways, but I kind of used the example of Alexander-Arnold and Rashford together in the same chapter, and kind of put them together to show how these two similar processes are happening within these two rival clubs at a similar time. This kind of relearning that was going on. So Alexander-Arnold was being converted from a midfielder to a right back, and Rashford was being converted from a winger or a number 10 to a number 9. And yeah, that process of feedback and video analysis and this careful approach to development was something that was explained to me by the Liverpool coaches, Michael Beale, who's now the QPR manager, and Neil Critchley, who's just replaced Michael Beale as Aston Villa's assistant manager to Gerrard, had been at Blackpool. They were the two of the coaches who worked most closely with Alexander-Arnold in that period, and I interviewed them both for the book, and they explained how some of it was kind of physical, and a lot of it was on the training pitch of just getting wingers to go at him and kind of let him sort of try and learn to swim in those sort of shark-infested waters, really. But a lot of it was feedback, a lot of it was going into the video room and getting buy-in from the player and saying, look, we think your skill set aligns well with this position for a very specific way of playing that will help you in your career. It'll give you the best chances of making it in the first team here as well, and that proves to be right for him. And then what I found most fascinating about Rashford, the United side of things, I spoke to Colin Little, who is now the Salford manager, who had Rashford under 16s when he was being developed into a striker. They were working on his finishing. Usually what you find with the most talented player in a given age group is that they'll be played with older players. They'll be what they call stretched. They'll play up an age group or two. With Rashford, they decided to hold him back. They wanted him to get more looks at goal, essentially. They wanted him to play with smaller, less physical players, less experienced players, so that he'd get more chances to refine his finishing. So rather than under 16s, him being stretched and playing under 18s football, which he was capable of from a skills perspective, they held him back to work on his finishing and getting more looks at goal and kind of refine his movement where there might be like a little bit more space. So I find that really interesting, and it's quite an innovative approach, almost counterintuitive. It goes against the conventional wisdom of youth football of stretching players and challenging them in that way. Yeah, of course,
There's, as you note in the book, I think one of the coaches from United says, well, our goal isn't to win games, it's to help players. And of course, most senior clubs or elite clubs now have sort of player development coach of some kind whose job it is to help make that bridge and, I guess, reduce the chances of a talented player not making it into the first team for first team use or for sale. One of the interesting anecdotes you also talk about is the average age of teams in Germany, and this is why players such as Jadon Sancho and Jude Bellingham and others have started to think about that as a better pathway. Not necessarily that it's better coaching, but something about German football and its financial model allows them to break through. And we've seen quite a train of English players do that, as well as players from, well, where I live now around the States. It's a very common pathway now.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think it's the financial model. There's just not as much money swimming around in the Bundesliga. And I guess perhaps as well, kind of Bayern has monopoly over that title, so teams are looking at other ways to kind of finance themselves. I think Borussia Dortmund are quite open about that being their model of buying players young and putting them in and developing them and then making them into superstars and selling them for lots of money. We just saw that with Haaland. We'll see it with Bellingham next year, I'm sure. Many other examples, Dembele, Sancho. But yeah, there's a genuine, generally, I think perhaps a little bit more faith in young players, a little more of a willingness to throw them in and to not only give them those garbage time minutes like I referred to before, but to sort of have the faith in them that they can do it. If that old adage that if you're good enough, you're old enough, I think they really kind of live by that in Germany more than we do over here. I think we feel as though there's so much money in the Premier League. There's millions of pounds at stake for every position within in the table. I think the clubs perhaps feel there's too much at stake to take that, what they will perceive as a risk of putting a young player in without allowing them. They don't want to allow them that necessary process of learning, of trial and error. Whereas in Germany, I think they have a more developmental mindset, and they can see they see the wood for the trees a bit.
It'd be interesting to see what happens with United. I'm a United podcast, so I have to bring it back to the club. But I think there was a level of frustration at the end of last season that Ralf Rangnick didn't want to give minutes to some of the younger players, and the senior players, the ones that are being paid the big bucks, the really big bucks, weren't doing it. So why not? And his excuse was, well, I don't want to put them in this situation. So it's like, but maybe it's one of your own making, mate. But but now we've got Erik ten Hag, who at Ajax obviously has a reputation for working with younger players, and it'll be interesting to see because he'll get a lot more leeway from fans if he fails but gives younger players a chance than if he fails and doesn't. And I think that's probably true with a lot of fan bases, isn't it? You want to see this pathway.
I think there's still nothing like it for a fan for a product of the academy, especially if they're relatively local, to come through and kind of quote unquote make it. I think that's still kind of up there as one of the most exhilarating things that a fan of a club can experience. So yeah, seeking that and working towards that is something I think will always buy a manager time from the fan base, perhaps not so much from his employers. But I think with Ten Hag, you have almost the kind of best of both worlds, in that you have that faith in youth that Solskjaer probably had to a certain degree, but you have a higher pedigree of coaching and development, a stronger track record to that end than Solskjaer did. So it's not just bringing them into a bad situation like Rangnick explained. It's bringing them in and thinking about what they need, hopefully, and how to progress them, and not just kind of, okay, you're here now, get on with it. It's, you're here, let's help you develop and learn while also contributing. So that would be the hope. Again, the hope's not a strategy, as you say, but yeah, I think that's what can be some degree of an expectation for Ten Hag, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see. It's been a hard transition going from winning everything I grew up. As the slogan goes, Fergie ruined your childhood. Well, he made mine. So, and it's been a hard transition to complete failure and being sort of something of a joke. But we'll see that, in 60-something thousand people turned up at that FA Youth Cup final last season. So there's real appetite to see some of these players make it at United. So last and definitely not least, but admittedly we don't look at this area but that much on this podcast, but you talk quite a bit about women's football in the book, and the challenges on the coaching side there, both for female coaches, of whom there are not enough, and the standards of coaching at women's youth level, which is kind of, another part of development of the women's game, but as football in general, to increase the standards there as well. So, it'd be interesting your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this turned out to be my favourite chapter in the book to write and put together was the one on women's football. So I went and spent the evening with Julie Grundy up at Liverpool's academy. I spent some time with Arsenal's female academy manager, James Honeyman. And then, spoke to female coaches who were working in the men's game as well to discuss their experiences, because at any one time there were only ever a handful. So I spoke to Manisha Taylor, who was at QPR and doing really well. So interviewed her and got her story. Really, really inspirational person with an incredible story of what she's overcome to get to where she is. And it's just really heartening to see how well she's doing and how she's progressing at QPR now. And hopefully inspiring others to do the same and follow suit, and inspiring clubs and policy shapers to create those pathways for more women in the men's game. On the playing side, I guess one of the most interesting takeaways I had from my discussions with academy managers, I was speaking with James Honeyman from Arsenal. He was saying that the fixed compensation aspect of EPPP that we discussed earlier has been, probably the most controversial aspect of it within the game.
Right.
He said the women's game could probably do with something like that, because at the moment there are no protections for clubs and their players. So one club can come and snatch another player and there's no recourse, essentially. There's no financial compensation whatsoever. So clubs and the people investing in clubs are reluctant to invest because for fear of losing those prospects. So he thinks some degree of a fixed compensation system or something along those lines might actually help and inspire a bit more faith from the money people to invest more in that side of the game. So that was probably my most interesting takeaway. And then just generally that the women's game, the women's youth game, appears to be in a place that approaching kind of a crossroads that the men's game sort of ploughed through a decade or so ago. And it's going to be interesting to see whether they learn the lessons and whether they take any kind of avoid any of the pitfalls that the men's game has fallen into.
Well, part of it's about money and resources, but part of it's about attitude as well of clubs, isn't it? So I think I was just looking at Arsenal's accounts, and they spend about £4 or £5 million a year on the women's team, but most of that is basically subsidised from the quote unquote men's club, the parent company. So the money is just on a different level completely. For now, we'll see. There's definitely appetite. We've seen some big crowds both in England and around Europe. Okay, well, I guess we'll leave it there. This is it's a really fascinating book, I've got to say. I learned a lot about youth football. I watch MUTV to understand youth football, and there's certainly listeners who dive into this area much more than I do. But this is really fascinating about both the policy and the structure and the pathway and the people involved, and the heartbreaking stories and the skullduggery and the money and all of that. So congratulations. And it's out now, or
it's been out a while. It came out last summer. So it was it's lots of United in there. Was fortunate enough to make a few of the kind of award lists this year. We're really pleased by the reception to it. Thank you.
No, fascinating book, and in all good bookstores, as they say. I think you're supposed to say. Yeah, well, Ryan, thanks very much for your time, and fascinating book, fascinating conversation. So.
Thank you. And hopefully, I'm actually working on one about United's treble at the moment, so maybe we'll come back and chat to you about that one day too.
Well, we certainly will. Good times.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.